name is Dr. Jerry Law, and I'm the Director of Family Education and Leadership Training for Meadows Behavioral Healthcare. Thank you for joining me today as we discuss the differences between enabling and helping, as well as how to establish and maintain healthy boundaries in your relationship with a loved one who is in our care. Enabling begins naturally enough when the helper cares about the suffering individual and wants to understand his or her concerns. However, the enabler may actually be colluding in the individual's denial and minimization. Now, I realize how harsh that may sound, so please stay with me as we discuss this important topic. In reality, denial is strengthened rather than diminished by well-meaning attempts to soften the damage. Enabling continues when the helper fears that any challenge to the individual's problem behavior will risk a break in the relationship. If the problem is ever to be resolved, however, it will be because the helper dares to intervene and break the cycle of enabling. So let's take a look at a definition for enabling. Here's a basic definition that I find helpful, along with some guidelines on how we can differentiate between enabling and helping. Let me use a metaphor. Let's think of enabling as a two-sided coin. On one side, we have what I refer to as assertive enabling. In short, this is when we take actions that make it possible for our loved one to continue in whatever dysfunction or disorder they are practicing or in which they are ensnared. Examples would include calling your loved one's employer or school to excuse him or her as being sick when in fact they have a hangover, or hiring the best lawyer in town in an attempt to have all charges dropped when in fact your loved one is guilty of the legal issues being presented. Perhaps it looks like telling your kids that their other parent cannot attend the school play because he or she has to work late, when in reality the spouse is drunk or high. The list may be endless. Now, the other side of the coin is often referred to as passive enabling. Now, this involves intentionally ignoring the signs and symptoms of your loved one's disorder with the hope that it's just a phase or some other short-term malady. Examples would include finding telltale evidence of repeated excessive viewing of online pornography or credit card charges that look suspiciously like the purchases of the services of a sex worker and choosing not to question those activities. Another example may be finding evidence of purging in your loved one's room or in the trash and choosing to just chalk it up to teenage experimentation. Passive enabling is often not seen as enabling at all, but rather just letting your loved one be themselves or express their personality. I know this is an area in which I struggle a great deal. So if any of these behaviors ring a bell, stop a moment and realize that these may be red flags that truly require your attention. Also, don't beat yourself up for past enabling in which you may have been involved, as this type of self-punishment may cause you to become stuck in the problem rather than addressing the issue with love, care, and concern. What truly matters is that you recognize these behaviors and that you reach out for help to make healthy changes in your interactions with your loved one. Here are some basic guidelines that may help you see how attempts to control or fix can so easily become enabling. Enabling is when we avoid discussions and confrontations. Accountability partners, on the other hand, address specific disruptive and distressing behaviors. Enablers soften consequences by minimizing the importance or impact of events. Accountability partners ensure that each negative behavior is followed by a consistent consequence, not punishment, consequence. A little more on that later. Enablers make excuses, cover for, and even defend problem behaviors. Accountability partners insist that individuals accept responsibility for their own actions. Lastly, enablers may indirectly or rarely recommend behavior changes. Accountability partners directly and frequently recommend such changes. Now that your loved one is in treatment, you may find him or her actually trying to set boundaries with you. In some cases, you might find this disturbing or even threatening, as your efforts to set boundaries with them were often rejected, ignored, or even scoffed. It can be frustrating when your loved one begins to turn the page, so to speak, and attempts to place restrictions on your relationship. Please know that it is not to be unexpected, and in many cases, your loved one is trying to apply the very new behaviors that will be needed in their own recovery. As hard as it may seem, try not to take it personally. As your loved one heals, he or she will begin to use language that you may find perplexing. As mentioned, they may initiate boundaries in your relationship. The challenge you might face is how to respond to this new behavior. First, know the difference between reacting and responding. Several years ago, I received a letter from the IRS. As I recall, the letter came in the month of October, so I knew it certainly was not about a refund. The letter stated that I owed additional tax due to not substantiating a particular deduction that I had claimed. I remember by the time I walked into the house, I was fuming. How dare they question me? I was clearly in reaction mode. At the bottom of the letter, I was asked to respond by a certain date and include the missing documentation. Well, I stewed all night and considered calling the local IRS office to, share my displeasure. But once I cooled off, I realized that all I needed to do was to respond with a brief letter and include a single-page missing form that was not included when I originally submitted my return. Problem solved. However, my initial reaction was anything but helpful. A significant component of discontinuing enabling behavior involves learning how to set and maintain healthy boundaries. Just as your loved one may begin setting boundaries with you, it will be imperative that you also learn to establish healthy boundaries with them. I'd like to share a brief analogy that you may find helpful. I reside in the city of Phoenix, Arizona. Now, in our town, many people have swimming pools in their backyard. It is the law here in Arizona that if you have a backyard pool, you take steps to reduce or eliminate access to the pool by young children. Homeowners may be required to have a pool fence, including a self-locking latch at a particular height, or a similar self-locking door from the home to the backyard or the location of the pool. Sadly, even with these laws on the books, several children die each year from drowning accidents. In addition to these fences and locks, parents and guardians need to be in the pool area rather than inside the home when young children are in the pool. Now, here's my point. When my daughter was 3 years old, it was imperative that an adult be present by the pool. That is a healthy boundary. However, now that she's in her 30s, the same behavior on my part would not be a healthy boundary. Rather, it would be an enabling behavior. My daughter is fully competent in the pool, and for me to insist that I be present is only sending a message that I own the consequences of her choices rather than her. This behavior on my part when she was 3 was appropriate, but completely improper now no matter how helpful my intentions. In working with families in recovery, I frequently make the following statement. Life, at perhaps its most fundamental level, is about choices and consequences. Healthy, functional adults make choices all day long and accept the consequences. Please do note that I'm using the word consequences, not punishment. Consequences are neutral until tied to a specific behavior. When I make good choices, they generally come with good consequences. When I make poor choices, painful or distasteful outcomes often come my way. My choices, my consequences. When your loved one is in the midst of a toxic behavior, disease, or disorder, they often make choices and expect you to bear the consequences. When you do, you are enabling the behavior. Learn to love your friend or family member enough to give them back the consequences of their choices. That is a critical component of a healthy relationship that includes solid boundaries. Not easy, but crucial to recovery. I'll conclude with one last story. A few years ago, an elderly loved one of mine was living in an environment that was no longer safe for her. She had resided in a mobile home in a seniors-only neighborhood for several years. She had many, many friends in the mobile home park, and the property was well managed, clean, and had no history of crime. But one day I was visiting, and she was having a conversation with one of her neighbors when they began to talk about something they called the death call. In an attempt to care for one another, several of these elderly residents had entered into a pact that if they did not see evidence of life at one another's home, such as bringing in the newspaper or raising of a window or a blind by 10 a.m., that they would call that individual and make sure they were still alive. Frankly, I was stunned by this and realized that I had been passively enabling this behavior. One of the most difficult conversations I've ever had with anyone was when I sat down with this loved one to tell her that I loved her enough to be very angry with me and living in a safe, healthy environment rather than being very happy with me because I was willing to go along with this bizarre living arrangement. There is nothing easy about these conversations, and I hope that I have not sounded like it's as simple as following these 3 little steps. These may be the most difficult conversations you'll ever have with anyone, and yet vitally important. It's crucial that you learn the language needed to send a message to your loved one that you love him or her and you are no longer willing to participate in enabling behaviors. Here's a couple of ideas you may want to adopt. Perhaps you say, I love you enough to give you back the choices of your consequences, or the consequences of your choices. Or as previously mentioned, I love you enough to have you very unhappy with me and getting the help you need rather than happy with me because I was willing to go along with your plan. Or I'm so sorry that I have chosen to do these things for you in the past, and I have confidence that you can handle them going forward. Or maybe I will move heaven and earth to support wellness and recovery, and I will not support anything else. Learning the language of healthy boundaries takes practice, persistence, and patience. You may find it helpful to write out a script that you will follow the next time you speak with your loved one. Practicing in front of a mirror or with a trusted friend will also go far in helping you learn new patterns of communication. Hard work for sure, but worth every minute you invest in the process.